Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to our first video having to do with that period immediately after the Civil War, which historians refer to as Reconstruction. It lasted from 1865 to 1877. What did it mean? Pretty self-explanatory. It was that period in which most of the country's efforts were revolved around reconstructing the Union after this war that had devastated and ruined so much of the country, particularly the South. How to bring the two halves back together again as one functioning nation. First, let's discuss the various challenges of this great task. What were the challenges of Reconstruction? Number one, how to readmit Confederate states and under what conditions. Not everyone agreed. Number two, how to rebuild and reshape the South's economy and society. Do we let it slip back into this feudal society in which, very few landowners, the planter class, the landed aristocracy, had the lion's share of land ownership and wealth? Or do we work towards having it reflect to a greater extent the emerging industrial modern economy of the North? What consequences for secessionist leaders and war criminals? Should we be lenient or should we be harsh? Not everyone agreed. And quite importantly, remember what this war was fought for. Eventually, that's what it came to free the slave. Well, now what? What do we do with 4 million ex-slaves who are in a very vulnerable position after this war? As far as plans go, let's go to the first one that was on the table. And it goes all the way back to December 8th, 1863, at around the time that the Union had just completed its Chattanooga campaign. President Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction was surprisingly a very, very lenient proposal. Why is it called the 10% plan? Lincoln's idea was if you served in the Confederate Army and you swear allegiance to the Union, he has no problem with that. The only thing he's asking is to ratify the 13th Amendment, therefore abolish slavery. If 10% of your voters pledge allegiance to the Union, you could form new state governments. Congress will approve your new application and you're back in the Union. All it takes is 10%. Forgiveness for all. In fact, by the time that Lincoln had passed away, already 3 states, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, had met that 10% threshold and had been readmitted into the Union under Lincoln's very lenient plan. Now, why so lenient? Well, I guess we could speculate on Lincoln's intentions. After such a brutal war, Lincoln wanted to prioritize reconciliation in getting the country back to one and back to a functioning country as soon as possible. Okay? As soon as possible. And he figured the way to not prolong this, the way to avoid hatreds and grudges and perhaps the re-eruption of war was to be as lenient as possible, even though he was going to upset many in his party. Remember, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was a moderate, if not moderate conservative Republican. He was concerned with how do we more practically end all of this? And of course, he's at odds with many of his party. As far as the question of African Americans, all the evidence points to Lincoln was willing to go as far as ending slavery. And that's about it. Not further than that. Lincoln was not on board extending equal rights to African Americans. He said 1 or 2 things about extending the vote, and that was only to actual veterans, African American veterans of the war. Lincoln, towards the end of his life, was still contemplating the possibility of recolonization as a solution to racial conflict in this world, in this country. Um, that, needless to say, a year later, Lincoln is reelected. A new Congress comes into power, the 39th Congress, and it gives a clear Republican majority. Congress is 73% Republican, but the Republican Party is split. Split between moderates and conservatives like Lincoln. They want to make this as easy as possible, want to be as forgiving as possible, and feel that we shouldn't have to go further than the 13th Amendment. And then there is a growing faction within the Republican Party, the radical Republicans, who very much their politics stem from much of it from the abolitionist tradition. In in the Senate, led by Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, this is the same senator a decade earlier that was attacked by Representative Preston Brooks, and in the House, Representative Thaddeus Stevens. Not only were these men the primary, he's from Pennsylvania, not only were these men the primary authors and architects of the 13th Amendment, which hasn't happened yet, we're going to get there, but they're also very, very important in determining the course of Reconstruction for years to come, and the leaders of the radical Republicans. And what makes the radical Republicans different than the more moderate ones? They want punishment. They want severe punishment for the secessionists, particularly the leaders, and they want more for African Americans. They want more than just the end of slavery. They want the extension of voting rights, and I mean the extension of basic rights under the Constitution, and many are even suggesting the right to suffrage. So whereas the Republican Party dominates Congress after Lincoln's reelection, there are divisions with the party. And remember, there's also a Democratic Party in Congress as well at this time. Well, the radicals present, as soon as they win their elections, their seats, they present an alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan. They refer to it as the Wade-Davis bill, and they passed it July 2nd, 1864. How is it different than the 10% plan? Well, it increases the requirement to 50% or above, so a majority of voters in those southern states have to pledge allegiance to the Union before being readmitted. Also, there is no possibility for actual war veterans, people that voluntarily, not drafted, but people that voluntarily took up arms against the Union. They shall not have their rights restored. Also, the radicals are very much in favor of punishing those that willingly took up arms against the Union, particularly landowners, by taking their land away. Okay, and this possibly leads to this is linked to the possibility of reparations for slavery in the form of land, confiscated land from ex-Confederates. As far as African Americans, of course, they want the end of slavery. They require ratification of the 13th Amendment as a precondition to rejoin the Union, but they also want basic rights under the Constitution for African Americans as well. So needless to say, it's more in the radical camp. Lincoln vetoes it. He doesn't outright veto it. He does what's called a pocket veto, meaning that he keeps it on his desk until the end of the year when Congress, the congressional session ends. He doesn't outright veto it because I think he doesn't want to give the Democrats ammunition against his party, which has this inner division. He doesn't want to give them this ammunition that they could put to use. So instead of outright going against members of his own party, he just decides to play coy and ignore the bill until the end of the congressional session, the end of the year, which the bill expires. And needless to say, he's the president. He feels that Reconstruction should be and be determined by the president, should be in the president's hands, not in the hands of Congress. um, Something that, despite what happens with the Wade Davis bill, as soon as they go back into session, well, before that even happens, one of the good things is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment passed during the 39th Congress. Actually passed the Senate first, and then it passes the House on the 31st of January, 1865, and it's going to be ratified by the end of the year. So let's read the wording a bit here, because yes, it does a great thing. It ends slavery, but as a compromise to the moderate and conservative Republicans as well as the Democrats, language was inserted that would allow for a loophole that proves to be quite problematic even till this day. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The loophole being as a punishment for a crime. So on its face, slavery ceases to exist in this country, but an exception is allowed to exist for the criminal. And you may think, okay, fine, well, as long as you're not a criminal, that's not an issue. Problem is, what if it comes to be that it becomes very easy to criminalize somebody? That's when you end up with, the problematic, you have to deal with the problems of this loophole. Before the House even got around to ratifying the 13th, to passing the 13th, much less ratification, my mistake, the House did pass it. But 4 months after that, the House passed the 13th Amendment, and 6 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, we know that Booth assassinated Lincoln. And with that, went out the window possibly the most lenient plan the South ever could have hoped for reuniting with the rest of the country. As much as Southerners like Booth hated Lincoln, by killing Lincoln, you eliminated the best possible deal on the table. Nothing is going to reemerge as lenient. And of course, martyrdom does that. Martyrdom does that. Now Lincoln is John Brown, something Lincoln never was, amazingly. But now Lincoln is referred is the great emancipator, the man that ended slavery. It was Lincoln's martyrdom that drove the ratification of the 13th Amendment more than anything else. And so who are we left with? A guy that nobody really expected. The only reason Andrew Johnson was on the ticket in 64 was this symbolic gesture that the Republicans thought would be a good idea, that a Northerner and a Southerner, a Republican and a Democrat could run together as a united ticket, and that in itself would symbolize the reconciliation and willingness to reunite the country that Lincoln was trying to run on. Okay, Andrew Johnson, he was the only senator from Tennessee that did not go to the South after secession. He was a Unionist through and through the entire thing, and he was rewarded for it. He was the military governor of occupied Tennessee. Um, but Johnson is not Lincoln. Johnson does not have the leadership skills of Lincoln. Johnson sees the war and how Reconstruction should be in a very particular way. As far as Johnson's concerned, this war was about secession, not really about slavery. And now that the war is over, secession has been defeated, it really shouldn't be that big of a deal bringing the country back together again. If he blames anybody, he blames the planter class, the landed aristocracy that shunned him throughout most of his career because he was not born into that kind of wealth and privilege. He blames them, and them pushing the country towards civil war so that they could continue to enjoy the benefits that come with owning land and owning people. But as far as the black people caught up in this mess, this 4 million slaves, he really doesn't care. He really doesn't care. In fact, he's of the opinion that when the South gets back on its feet, the South should be governed by white men like it was before. The planter class were punished for it, and as far as he's concerned, it's over. He actually issues quite broadly, an amnesty to, it's, if a majority of you say, I'm sorry, I'm fine with it. The only people that he has an issue with are, the big planters and high-ranking leaders of the Confederacy. So, presidential Reconstruction under Johnson. It runs from 65 to 67. He has his own twist on this. Just like Wade Davis, and it's a bit of a combination between the 10% and the Wade Davis bill. Just like Wade Davis, he's going to require the majority of voters in that state to pledge allegiance to the Union. As far as Confederate war veterans, okay? Like Lincoln and unlike Wade Davis, if you say I'm sorry and you pledge, he's fine with, restoring your rights, and you could come back into the Union as well. As far as African Americans, as far as he's concerned, he's stopping at the 13th Amendment. Slavery is over, but no more than that. So, for example, what Sherman did with 40 acres and a mule, the special field order, he's not okay with that. In fact, he believes that all the land that, at least momentarily, was either abandoned or taken over by the Union and handed over to slaves, ex-slaves, that land needs to be restored to its former owners. And by the way, the pardoning is, if you owned, I believe, something like more than $20,000 in land, if you were one of these large planters, you got to ask him personally for a pardon, which ends up not being very hard. So, in other words, Johnson passes this blanket pardon of vast majority of Confederate war veterans, with the exception of war criminals and war leaders and people that voluntarily fought for the Confederacy. And he orders the restoration of all. Once a president pardons you, you're pardoned of all wrong. And he orders the restoration of their lands, which means taking away land from ex-slaves that have been enjoying that land in that brief period since Sherman gave it to them. And the most problematic part are these personal pardons, which on its face sound pretty difficult. Like, wow, you have to personally ask President Johnson for a pardon. He hands these things out like candy, okay? 14,000 by the end of the year. 14,000 pardons, the vast majority of them to high-ranking members of the Confederate government, Confederate state governments, and the Confederate military. The end result of that, they're going to have some elections, special elections in November of 1865 for those states that have been readmitted into the Union under the Johnson and Lincoln plans. And since so many high-ranking officials were pardoned, over 60 former high-ranking Confederates run for office, either in Congress or in their various state legislatures. And probably the most obscene example of this travesty of justice, former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, not only receives a pardon from President Johnson, but wins back his congressional seat in Georgia. And that incensed many, many Northerners. By December, 13th Amendment is ratified and it becomes law across the country. And mind you, by December, Kentucky still had 65,000 slaves, which no longer are slaves after the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So let's talk about those 4 million. And at this point, it's not 4 million anymore because a substantial number left during the war. So probably 3.5 million freemen, okay, ex-slaves left behind in the South. Now let's talk about the South. The state of the South. The South is in ruins. The rail network has been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of acres of arable land has been left fallow or is in ruins. Confederate money is worthless. So any money that anybody had in any Southern bank is not even worth the paper that it's written on. Poverty, hunger, disease, ruin are widespread. And in that reality, 3.5 million ex-slaves who themselves are landless, and Johnson's going to make sure of that, penniless, don't have a home, are hungry, require medical attention, are illiterate, and don't know how to do anything else but field work. Yes, they have been freed, but there is no plan, okay, to determine what's next for them. A number of them followed the Union Army up north. And that's where you had the birth of African American communities in places like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, but the vast majority stayed behind in the South. The South must be rebuilt, okay? Johnson's going to see to it that white Southerners get their land back, okay? And the land, like it was before, will be the key to rebuilding the South. But who's going to work that land now that slavery has been abolished? Whites throughout the South, pretty quickly, come to the determination that black bodies are going to have to be put on that land to work that land to rebuild the Southern economy. This is going to happen one of two ways. Let's talk about the black codes. As soon as Southern governments started to be readmitted to the Union, either during the Lincoln 10% plan or the little bit more demanding Johnson plan, and the large number of ex-Confederate leaders once again fell into places of leadership throughout their states. Then they started putting into place systems of control and governance that would try to approximate as much as possible the old social order, while at the same time outright not having slavery, because they all ratified the 13th Amendment. And ultimately, the goal is, how do we get black bodies back to work again to rebuild the South? Black codes were a series of laws. Not that they were written, slave codes existed. There were always laws throughout the South that were particular, focused on slaves. All they did was scratch the word slave and put in the word black. Okay? Sets of laws throughout the South aimed at extracting labor from freedmen, aimed at controlling and restricting the lives of freedmen to the greatest degree possible. I can't, institute slavery anymore, but the 13th says for a crime, if you're a criminal, well, it gives me an exception. So now the challenge is, I need to criminalize you so I could get away with doing to you what I used to do before. And for that, we're going to write laws that makes it very easy to criminalize freedmen throughout the South. Vagrancy. If the authorities find you homeless or unemployed, something that was widespread, they'll charge you with vagrancy. Can't pay the fine, you're going to work it off in jail. Debt, you owe money, that's a criminal offense, and you're going to work it off. Everybody, Black Code said, everybody had to have a job. If you didn't have a job with a contract with a landowner, Another criminal offense, you're going to jail. Children that were unattended, orphan children, or children under no supervision while their parents were working could be taken by the state and put into an apprenticeship, which translated into put to work. And other restrictions. They couldn't own land. They couldn't sell the product of whatever they produced on land for themselves. All these tons of restrictions that almost sounded like carbon copies of the things that existed during the period of slavery. What did this lead to? The first prison boom in American society. All of a sudden, there's a boom in the opening up of prisons throughout the South. By the 1870s, 95% of the South's prison population is black. Okay? Not only that, we also see the birth of the first police departments in southern towns and cities, because as soon as the war ended, many freedmen drifted to the towns and cities looking for work, looking for wage labor, and whites not wanting to live, side by side in the cities with these new freedmen. As you see the birth of the first police departments. How did they benefit from this? Through convict leasing. They would lease convicts over to private enterprise, to private, owners of land, and that's how they worked off their debts. So we're going to get you to work either to making you a criminal, and if you don't want to be a criminal, if you don't want to be labeled a criminal and be put on a chain gang or be leased out to a private landowner, then we suggest you find work any way possible for whatever they pay as soon as possible. And this is how you ended up with the other means by which to put black people to work, through sharecropping. And this was the lamentable situation. Okay. Once Johnson sees to it that all the land goes back to white owners and there will be no reparations. Okay. The fact of the matter was 80% of freemen after the war owned no land. And by the end of the century, it's going to be nearly 100%. About 25% of them fell into wage labor, but you have a substantially large number of freedmen that they had to eat, they needed a roof over their head, and lamentably, many of them went right back to their former owners to ask for work. It was either that or being charged with vagrancy, or dying of hunger. Okay, that was true too. Whites coming back might have had the deed to their land, but they had no money. They had no money to pay for wages, so the arrangement they worked out was something called sharecropping. In other words, I'll let you live on a portion of my land, and you could work that land, you could plant on that land, what I'm going to tell you to plant, of course, and then you basically pay me rent. You pay me the rent to live on that land. You could either pay me in kind, with a portion of your harvest, or as a tenant farmer, you pay me in cash the rent, like anybody renting an apartment, for your right to live back there. But also understand, this sounds a lot easier than what it actually was. These people were starting from zero. So we need food, we need clothing, we need building materials to build a home, we need tools, we need equipment, we need planting equipment, we need seeds, we need all these things, and we have nothing. Okay, fine. And this is where the crop lien system showed up, the system of credit that worked around this and actually further entrenched it. You don't have these things, so I'm going to give them to you on credit, meaning I'm giving them to you now and you're going to pay for it later, and we're going to add that to the rent that you also owe me. So now your debt to look forward to is not just the rent for your right to live on that piece of land and work that land, but also everything that you purchased on credit to get started. And here's the cycle. The sharecropper is provided land and seed. In exchange, he promises the landowner half the crop, because sometimes the payment was half. Or if it was worked out in terms of cash, the interest rate would be set up like 50%. Sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store. These country stores were the ones that extended this credit. Sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. And of course, in the contract, these contracts were crazy. The contract told you what you must plant, which was usually cotton, because it brought in a lot of money. It was the only way feasible to pay off this incredible debt. You couldn't walk away from it. You couldn't quit, because then the landowner could call the cops basically, and they're gonna bring you back not as a sharecropper but as a convict. Some of these contracts even gave the landowners the right to physically punish um, the sharecroppers that lived on their land. So the sharecropper, number four, gives the landowner a crop to sell. Sharecropper will get half the earnings minus the cost of the purchases for the year. When settling up, step five, it's never enough. They always worked out the math that you owe more than what you actually produced. Therefore, we're going to have to tag on what you owe for next year, for the next harvest. So now you're starting the next harvest already with a debt, plus you have to, again, buy on credit all these things. What did this guarantee? Poverty and debt. If the black codes guaranteed bondage via crime, being labeled a convict, sharecropping guaranteed bondage via debt. And so long as you were indebted to the landowner, and they always worked out the math that you always owed more than you produced, you were going to stay there. And sharecropping would stay around until well into the 20th century. And the issue of criminalizing black men for the purpose of extracting labor through uh, laws that not only are targeted towards black men, but also, the black community, as it was then, as it is today, overly policed, overly arrested, disproportionate numbers, disproportionately over policed, disproportionately over arrested, disproportionately over convicted, disproportionately overly incarcerated. And even till today, convict leasing, leased out to private firms for prison labor, for convict labor. But it's not all bad, right? There is a bright side here. Um, the federal government, at the request of some of the more forward-thinking members of Congress, created the federal government's first ever welfare agency, the Freemen's Bureau, which was actually founded in 1865 as a part of the War Department until itself is an independent agency. What did the Freemen's Bureau do? It founded schools. Okay, it expanded literacy and education. The South did not have a public school system. The birth of the public school system throughout the South came with the Freemen's Bureau and the schools that were set up by the Freemen's Bureau, which provided educational opportunities not just to newly free black children, but to poor white children as well. Food, medical attention, they set up hospitals. They provided legal assistance, particularly with labor contracts. Something that was in great demand, they offered assistance in helping ex-slaves find family. That was a huge priority for these freedmen. Finding, mothers being reunited with children, husbands with wives, siblings, trying to reunite these families. Marriage, all of a sudden, all these freedmen wanted to get married. They wanted to legally, unlike existed before, but under the law and have it documented and licensed, marriage and form families. Um, Banks to extend credit, okay, to make it possible to buy land. And the Freemen's Bureau, not as much as it could, but it did help some people acquire land at very good price. And what were some of the achievements of the Freemen's Bureau, which unfortunately only lasted a couple of years until Congress decided to pull the plug? Um, you go from 0% literacy to about 80% literacy among African Americans by 1870. By 1870, they opened up 14,000 schools and taught over 200,000 children, many of them white as well. I'm going to read an excerpt from Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower, which I've read it to you before. Approved by Congress on March 3, 1865, was the Freemen's Bureau, the first federal welfare agency. It stood between the freedmen and the wrath of their former slave masters. It gave direct medical aid to some 1 million freedmen, established hospitals and social agencies, and distributed over 21 million rations, many of them to poverty-stricken whites. The agency also established day schools, night schools, industrial schools, and institutes and colleges. Many of the major black colleges, the historical black colleges and universities, were founded or received substantial financial aid from the Freemen's Bureau. Places like Howard, the first ever historical black college, founded by Union General O.O. Howard. But of course, there were those that didn't like it and didn't want it and fought it and used the same arguments and the same tropes, except more explicitly, against any sort of government-funded welfare assistance to the less fortunate and the needy. And this is where you get the trope of, oh, I don't want my tax dollars being spent to help lazy black people. So it's funny. It would be more implied today. It would be more covert today, but it's the same arguments. That why should a white person pay taxes to help people that don't want to work? And it's the same racist trope, and just like it was used then, it's used today. Except back then it was much more unapologetically and explicit and overt than it is today. But despite the haters, the Freemen's Bureau did great things, achieved great things in the brief time of its existence. Congress feels that these southern states are subverting the spirit of Reconstruction with their black codes. They know very well what they're doing. So Congress attempts to pass two bills, one to undermine the black codes and essentially make them illegal, and the other one to expand and fund and make an independent agency of the Freemen's Bureau. Civil Rights Act, the first one in this country's history, of 1866, would prohibit any laws that would discriminate against people on the basis of their skin, color, race. That means it would automatically make the black codes unconstitutional. Congress passed it on March 13th, 1866, and in true form, Andrew Johnson vetoed it. But it's a different game now. The Republicans have more than a 3/4 majority in all of Congress, and they easily overturned that veto on April 9th, 1866, making Civil Rights Act law, and at least on paper, even though they would drag their feet for a very long time, making the black codes illegal. Again, they passed a spending bill to expand the Freemen's Bureau on the 3rd of July of 1866. It was vetoed by President Johnson, and they went ahead and they overturned that veto and made it effective the 17th of July. This marks what's been gradually been building up, this conflict, this opposition between the president and Congress. And probably the real opening salvo, the one that they really gave it to the president, was with the passage of the 14th Amendment. And people like Sumner were very much the architects of this. Worried that they might take the Civil Rights Act to court and gut it, they put together the 14th Amendment. I don't want to rush this. We don't have a whole lot of time, but the 14th Amendment is, after the first, possibly the most important amendment of the Constitution. I see it as one of the twin crown jewels of the Constitution because it establishes so many things. So let me read you section 1. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That is called the Citizenship Clause. It establishes citizenship by birth. If you were born here, which is we don't realize this. This is a particularly new world phenomenon. It's not like that in the rest of the world where blood determines citizenship. This gets rid of Dred Scott. This nullifies that Supreme Court decision. It basically says if you were born here or you were naturalized, you are a citizen of the United States. Number 2, and therefore have rights. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Therefore, whatever constitutional rights the Constitution gives you as a citizen of the United States, no state has the right to take them away from you. This is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Number 3, because states since the beginning claimed that, well, how can you enslave people if the Fifth Amendment says that you cannot deprive somebody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law? Well, the South response was, well, that only applies to the federal government. So the 14th Amendment closes that loophole. It says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It used to apply to the federal government. Now it applies to the states. You cannot deprive anybody of that if they have not been given their due process under the law. And lastly, the one that's been pulled out the most, this was basically the locomotive of the civil rights movement. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All persons, regardless of their differences, must be treated the same and be extended equal protection under the law. This is the first section of the 14th Amendment, the most litigated, the most known, the most important but there's another part of it that's also important. And this is section 2 and section 3. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. But when the right to vote at any election is denied or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation shall be reduced. It establishes a penalty. Okay? If everybody has the rights of citizenship, if you're born or naturalized here, okay? What it does, it repeals the 3/5 compromise. Now representation is based on population purely. Okay? If states attempt to deny or abridge the right to vote, okay, this is kind of heading towards the 15th Amendment, but it doesn't solidify that right as securely and concretely as the 15th would. Congress has the right to punish that state by reducing its representation. Okay? And lastly, it says that if you committed a crime or participated in rebellion, you do not have the right to vote. So if you were lucky enough to get pardoned by Johnson and Lincoln, that's great. But if not, let's make this clear. You don't have a right to vote anymore. Section 3, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any other state who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid and comfort to enemies thereof. That means you can't hold office if you were once part of the Confederacy. Okay? But Congress can change this by a 2/3 vote. By the 21st of July, 1868, 8 of the former rebel states had ratified the 14th. But some states dragged their feet for a very long time because they did not like that it implied giving voting rights, citizenship, and by extension voting rights to everyone, including black men. So the 15th makes it nationwide, but under the 14th, it was already happening in many states. Johnson didn't like it. Johnson felt it went too far, Johnson claimed that it discriminated against whites by favoring blacks. So Johnson makes it a point right before the midterm elections to go on a speaking tour in August, September of 1868. The elections are in November. Um, Talking to voters, he went on this tour all over the Northeast, telling them not to vote for radicals. These radical Republicans that the ones that want to extend black equality and black suffrage, these people are as bad as the secessionists. And just like the secessionists, these people are going to bring racial strife. They're going to destroy this country. But he was not the greatest of speakers. He was not very charismatic. I think he underestimated how much of a mandate he actually had. And instead of convincing people, what he actually ended up doing was turning people away and getting people upset. His lower class origins would show, and he would become upset, and he would say things very much off the cuff, very vulgar comments, etc., etc. He tries to remedy this by forming a friendship with Ulysses S. Grant, which you see in that picture there, but it doesn't quite help. If Johnson's objective was to convince voters to vote against radical Republicans, at the end of this tour, he's achieved almost the complete opposite. Because by the time the midterm elections come around in November and the votes are counted, the Republicans now control 82% of Congress. More than before, and more than enough to yank Reconstruction out of Johnson's hands, which is exactly what they're going to do. And we'll talk about that next time.